Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Sabaretnam, Additional Professor, Department of Endocrine and Breast Surgery, Sanjay Gandhi Postgraduate Institute of Medical Sciences, Lucknow. And I shall be presenting today on endothelium as an endocrine organ. And I should thank ma'am and Professor Jamuna for this opportunity. And very interesting and very intriguing topic. And most importantly, it's a old wine in a new bottle. Lot of research has been going on in present times in this topic. So I should thank ma'am for taking pains to give this topic. And as I will say, like, still many phenomena are not well understood. So as an endocrine surgeon, we have well-established endocrine organs like pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal, and the endocrine pancreas. And the unusual endocrine organs, such as endothelium, the adipose tissue, and the connective tissue. The endothelium, the adipose tissue, and connective tissue has got a lot of functions, which is not very well understood, and many of us do not give much importance. But endothelium is still a mystery, and a lot of things we need to know. I will try to make things simple, where if you want to do research or want to learn more, there are a lot of literature available. You can read from them. And what is endothelium? It's a single layer of squamous endothelial cells that line the interior surface of the blood vessels and the lymphatic vessels. The endothelium form an interface between the circulating blood or lymph in the lumen and rest of the vessel wall. Endothelial cells form the barrier between the vessels and tissue and control the flow of substances and fluid into and out of tissue. Endothelial cells in direct contact with the blood are called vascular endothelial cells, whereas which are in direct contact with the lymph are known as lymphatic endothelial cells. Vascular endothelial cells line the entire circulatory system from the heart to the smallest capillaries. That is very important. Here you see endothelial cells lining the innermost layer, and any vessel will have intima, media, and adventitia. Adventitia will have the fibroblast, the most thickened layer, and media is important, but endothelium is the most important among all three layers, the endothelial lining. And some endothelial cells will have special unique function, which include fluid filtration, such as in glomerulus of the kidney, blood vessel tone, hemostasis, neutrophil recruitment, and hormone trafficking. Endothelium of the interior surface of the heart chambers is known as endocardium. Any damage to the endothelial cells or the endocardium can result in disastrous effect throughout the body. And endothelium functions, I will come to it. Endothelium forms an interface between the circulating blood vessels or the lymph in the lumen and rest of the vessel wall. This forms a barrier between the vessels and the tissue and control the flow of substances, as I already said. Passage of materials and transit of white blood cells in and out of bloodstream. The other aspects of vessel function of endothelial cells include blood clotting, which is thrombosis and fibrinolysis, and formation of new vessels, angiogenesis, in activity signaling of white blood cells of the immune system during inflammation, and constriction and enlargement of vessels, vasoconstriction and vasodilatation, hence by controlling the blood pressure. And vascular endothelium is well suited to regulate metabolic homeostasis. Before we go into that, blood vessels can be divided into two categories. This is very, very important. One is macrovasculature and microvasculature. Macrovasculature is composed of large vessels such as arteries and veins, and it's responsible for carrying the blood towards and away from the organs. Whereas the microvasculature, the small arterioles, the capillaries, and the venules primarily participate in the regulation of local perfusion and metabolic exchange between circulation and peripheral tissues. In most organs, arterioles are well innervated and highly responsive to sympathetic vasoconstriction. They play a major role in tuning the vascular resistance and blood flow volume. ultimately influencing the downstream capillary fluid exchange. Capillaries and post-capillary venules are the main site of fluid and macrovascular exchange. Because of the low shear stress force and selective expression of endothelial adhesion molecules, venules are also important sites of leukocyte adhesion. This is very, very important. And vascular endothelium, as I already said, is a single simple squamous cell lining the interior surface of the entire vascular system. And it's a critical bond. That is very, very important. In capillaries, you have to understand only one thing. There is only endothelial lining in the capillaries. So there is a large surface area and it's highly permeable for exchange of gases, fluids, electrolytes, and macromolecules. That is why initially in olden days, endothelium was the largest endocrine organ in the body. And this is also very, very important, these basic things. Before we understand the most complicated things, capillaries are of three types: continuous capillaries, fenestrated capillaries, and discontinuous capillaries. Continuous capillaries are low permeability conduits. These are located in skeletal muscle, heart, adipose tissue, lung, skin, and the CNS. Fenestrated capillaries are located at the choroid, plexus of the brain, and endocrine organs. Whereas in liver, bone marrow, and spleen, discontinuous capillaries or sinusoids are present. This is very, very important. And endothelial cells serve as the first responder in the modulation of vascular tone, permeability, and interaction with circulating macromolecules. And activation of endothelial cells is an upstream event necessary to expand the vascular network through the process of vasculogenesis, angiogenesis, and arteriogenesis, which is very important in your pathophysiogenesis of carcinomas and cancers. The close anatomic association between the metabolic cells and the endothelial cells, especially microvascular endothelial cells, play a critical role in metabolic exchange, suggests that they possess functional interdependence. And dysregulation of endothelial cells contribute to many of the cardiovascular, circulatory, and blood diseases in response to metabolic stress and vascular injury. However, we have to understand how endothelial cells regulate this homeostasis. Metabolic homeostasis remains, as on date, not clearly understood. And dysregulation of endothelial cells can aggravate insulin resistance, adipose inflammation, diabetes mellitus, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and other metabolic conditions. And coming to the hardcore endothelial hormonal mechanisms, energy homeostasis is a very important thing, where it's a balance between energy inflow and energy expenditure. Energy provision, ATP, required for daily activity is mainly provided within the body by two types of macromolecules, carbohydrates and lipids. Major organs or tissues that are involved in the regulation of energy metabolism include the brain, the GIT, liver, adipose tissue, pancreas, and the muscle. Tightly regulated cellular torque in and between these organs or tissues play a central role in maintaining energy homeostasis in vital organs and individual health. And excess calorie intake, stationary lifestyle, genetic predisposition lead to disruption of energy balance and contributes to development of metabolic disease such as obesity, metabolic syndromes, and diabetes mellitus, insulin resistance, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Most important is this slide. Dietary carbohydrates and lipids are digested and processed into glucose and fatty acids. When glucose perfuses pancreatic endocrine tissue, it increases the intracellular ATP in pancreatic beta cells and promote insulin secretion. Insulin in turn activates the insulin receptors, mediated signaling pathways in the skeletal muscles, heart, adipose tissue, resulting in increased glucose transport for mediated glucose uptake. This is most important. So when endothelial cells don't function properly, you can say this will not happen and patient will have many symptoms and signs of diabetes. And coming to endothelial response to metabolic dyshomeostasis, although the microvascular endothelium is critical for metabolic exchange, the detailed regulatory transendothelial transport of fatty acids, lipoproteins, and metabolic hormones and regulators are not completely understood, because endothelial cells actively communicate with the surrounding cells in metabolic tissues by secreting metabolic activators. Recent reports suggest that endothelial-derived metabolic regulators such as nitric oxide, extracellular matrix proteins, hormones, growth factors, and enzymes contribute to such regulation. And endothelial cells also regulate metabolic tissues indirectly through its own activation, proliferation, and differentiation. Endothelial barrier function in metabolic regulation, this is very important. Endothelial permeability is regulated by two distinct pathways. The transcellular pathway, through which solutes are actively transported across the endothelial layer, or the paracellular pathway, by which solutes passively move through the intracellular space between the neighboring endothelial cells. So you have the transcellular pathway, the paracellular pathway. This is also very, very important. And coming to the transendothelial transport, this is a very busy figure. We have to understand only one thing. Cardiomyocytes secrete vascular endothelial growth factor B, which will activate the fatty acid binding protein, transporting protein, and thereby the lipids are fatty acids are transported across the endothelium. This is very important. So anything you have to understand which factor, where it acts, and what it transports. That's all. We need not memorize. People who are doing research will need to know about all these factors. Otherwise, we just need to know the concepts, right? And recent observations, especially with genetic approaches, suggest that endothelial cells play a critical role in controlling the transcytosis of fatty acids, lipoproteins, glucose, hormones such as insulin. So see the endocrine activity, as well as it secretes so many mediators which will act far off. These are all considered hormones. That is why the term endothelium as an endocrine organ. However, understanding is still preliminary and lot of questions need to be answered. For example, integrated TG transcytose through ECs how, and fatty acid binding protein, transporting protein, and CD36 coordinate together for fatty acid transport how. Does the transport of these macromolecules take place bidirectionally or unidirectionally? In addition to amino acids such as arginine and citrulline, what role do they play in metabolic homeostasis? These are very, very important. And this is a very busy slide. So fatty acid transport we saw. So is there a single model and a signaling effect? No, it's a big no. See, you see fatty acid, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of model systems which have been proposed. We have given the people who have proposed that model, and signaling effect and what metabolic phenotype does it result on. So for example, fatty acid, if you see the DB mice or diabetic human subject, increase 3 HIB levels, and you can see the metabolic. And if you have LDL, then LR dependent transcytosis of LDL across the blood-brain barrier. And so similarly, we have for oxLDL, HDL, lipoprotein lipase, and glucose. So see, as I already said, these are all various proposed models and signaling effects. If you go into each of these things, and these are all facts which are available in most of the recent review articles, and I don't think anybody needs to know or memorize these facts, just need to know what kind of model system did they propose. For example, mice of like vascular endothelial growth factor B, and if it is not there, what it happens. And For example, you can see lipid deposition is there and ameliorated insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So these things, we need to know the concepts, okay? And similarly, leptin and insulin also. Insulin also, Kunshi et al., this, they said that delayed insulin signaling in muscle, fat, and brain, hyperinsulinemia, impaired glucose tolerance, exacerbated HFD induced insulin resistance. So these are many proposed models. And coming to factors which these endothelial cells secrete, again a very busy slide, but you need to know only most important factors: nitric oxide, then extracellular matrix proteins, thrombospondin, hepatocyte growth factors, platelet-derived growth factors, and lipase. So here, if you see, again, for nitric oxide, so many model systems are there, but you see the signaling effect, what all it can produce: hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, hyperlipidemia, metabolic syndromes, visceral obesity, triglyceridemia. So that is very important, very important again. And enterolipases also play an important role in systolic function and LV, impaired systolic function and LV dilatation. And coming to the role, metabolic regulation of other organs by endothelial secreted factors. This is a very important slide. If you see adipose tissue, I said one of the most unusual endocrine organs: increased adipocyte browning and fat oxidation, platelet-derived growth factor and nitric oxide in liver, increased insulin resistance, hepatocyte growth factor, increased liver growth, and then you have increased plasma HDL, increased cardiac fatty acid uptake and decreased heart failure, increased food intake by action on brain, and increased exocrine and endocrine function of pancreas, increased insulin secretion, increased insulin sensitivity in the muscles as well. This is very, very important. If all these things are impaired, you will get all the things, diseases which I have told. So this is very, very important slide. This much everybody should know. And take home message. So I have not gone into the in-depth molecular mechanisms. Being a clinician, we need to have we want the bedside part of it, not the bench side. And coming to the take-home message, we now understand that vascular endothelium has evolved over the past 2 decades with recognition that it's a dynamically regulated organ and it plays a nodal role in many of the physiological and pathological processes. And it forms not only a barrier between the circulation and peripheral tissues, but also actively regulate the vascular tone, blood flow, and platelet function. Dysregulation of endothelial cells contributes to pathological conditions such as vascular inflammation, atherosclerosis, hypertension, cardiomyopathy, retinopathy, neuropathy, and cancer. There is a close anatomic relationship between the vascular endothelium and highly vascularized metabolic organ tissues, which suggests that there is a crosstalk between the endothelial cells and the organs, which is vital for both vascular as well as metabolic homeostasis. And numerous reports support that hyperlipidemia, hyperglycemia, and other metabolic stress result in endothelial dysfunction and thereby vascular complications. This is very, very important. And however, we still need to know many things about this metabolic homeostasis and how the vascular endothelium regulates it. Thank you so much. Again, very interesting topic. I hope I have covered the basics, and as on date, we have to understand there are many hormones, many regulators, many inflammatory markers, many cytokines, so many things which still needs elucidation. Thank you again, ma'am, for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.